She thought she'd buried her past in the frozen silence of Montana's woods. But when a wild lynx knocked on her door, carrying its injured baby, Emily Monroe faced a question no one could have prepared her for. Would she risk breaking the laws of nature to keep a mother's desperate prayer alive? What happened next defied every rule and every boundary between wild and human. Stay with us. This is not just a story. This is a silent miracle whispered beneath the pines. Before we begin this unforgettable story, would you mind sharing where you're from in the comments? And if stories of love, loyalty, and second chances move you, please give this video a like and consider subscribing. The town of Hamilton, Montana, lay draped in a hush of white, mid-January, and the Bitterroot Valley was locked in the kind of cold that made the trees brittle and the mountains feel ancient. A pale sun hung low over the jagged peaks, bleeding light through clouds like frosted glass. Snow clung to every pine needle and blanketed the earth in a stillness that almost dared the living to move. Somewhere at the edge of this winter silence stood a solitary wooden cabin, smoke curling gently from its stone chimney, tucked beneath a cluster of firs like a secret held close. Emily Monroe had lived in that cabin for 3 winters now. At 38, she bore the calm resilience of someone who had seen too much and said too little. Her once blonde hair was now a quiet shade of honey brown, always pulled back in a low knot, and her green eyes, while kind, rarely sparkled. She moved with a grace that hinted at discipline. Her years as a military nurse had carved precision into every gesture, tall and lightly built, with long fingers and strong shoulders. She wore layers of wool and canvas like armor, the kind not meant for fashion but for surviving both cold and memory. It was memory that had driven her here, after the IED that killed her husband, Captain Andrew Monroe, in Syria. Emily had unraveled slowly, privately. The cities were too loud, hospitals too bright, so she came west, back to the land of his childhood stories, to the wilds he had once dreamed of retiring to, here, among the howling winds and dense timberland. She hoped to stitch herself back together. That morning, the sky was colorless, barely lit. Emily had woken early, she always did, and brewed strong black coffee in her battered percolator. Wrapping herself in a thick green coat, she stepped out onto the porch, mug steaming in her hands. Her boots crunched lightly on the planks. Beyond the porch rail, the forest spread out in layered quiet. Everything was still until she saw them. Tracks, not fresh, not buried either. They crisscrossed the snow-covered yard just beyond the clearing. A set of deep paw prints with spacing too wide for a fox and too delicate for a wolf. Emily set her coffee down and stepped down carefully, following the trail to where it vanished behind the knot of rhododendrons that marked the forest edge. She crouched low, examining the shape of the print. 4 toes, no claw marks. Cat. She straightened, eyes scanning the brush, and then she saw them. 2 glints of pale amber, barely distinguishable from the snow. Eyes, watching her, unmoving. The animal was perfectly still, its coat a shadowy mix of silver and ash, speckled faintly with darker spots, a lynx, Canadian. Judging by the tufted ears and thick ruff around the face, female. By the smaller stature and narrow hips, she was young, maybe 5 years old. Emily didn't move, didn't blink. The lynx held her gaze for a heartbeat longer. Then, without sound, slipped back into the woods. Emily stood frozen for a while, the cold forgotten. It wasn't fear she felt, but reverence. She had seen bobcats before from afar, even once a mountain lion slinking across the road at night, but never a lynx, never this close. She returned to her porch and sat with her coffee gone cold, the image of those ghostly eyes still burning in her mind. Later that day, she called Daniel. Daniel Monroe was Andrew's younger brother, and the only family Emily still spoke to, in his early 40s. Daniel worked as a wilderness ranger for the U.S. Forest Service, patrolling sections of the Bitterroot National Forest. He had a square build, with a permanent sunburn on the back of his neck, and a beard that seemed to always be 3 days old. His voice carried the steady confidence of someone used to solving problems, but under it lay a quiet sorrow that mirrored Emily's in a way neither of them ever discussed. "Lynx," he said. After she described the encounter, "Are you sure I'm sure? Female. She was watching me." There was a pause. "You didn't try to feed it." "Did you?" "No," Emily replied, knowing exactly why he was asking. "But I was thinking of leaving something out. Just scraps. It's brutal out here this week." Daniel sighed. I know you mean well, but you can't start doing that. It's against wildlife management guidelines. You feed them, you change their behavior, you blur lines that are there for a reason." She didn't look like she was hunting well. She's a lynx. She's built for snow. If she's not hunting well, that's nature, not your fault. Emily said nothing. Daniel softened. "I get it. You're out there, alone, and it feels like connection, but wild is wild for a reason. You help too much, and you could get her killed." "I'm not planning on taming her," she said quietly. I don't know, I feel like she came for a reason. You always did read too much into things. I always did believe in purpose," she countered. They left it there. Emily promised not to feed the lynx, and Daniel promised to call again soon. But that night, as the wind picked up and a few stray snowflakes drifted across the windows, Emily left half a piece of raw venison at the edge of the clearing. Just once. Just to see. The meat was gone the next morning. She told herself it could have been a raccoon or a fox, but when she stepped out with her coffee, her eyes scanned the forest edge again, and there they were, too pale, watching lights, deep in the brush, not closer, not tamed, but still there. Emily didn't speak. She simply nodded. A silent acknowledgement offered across the snow. In the weeks to come, she would see those eyes more often. Some mornings they were gone, others they were waiting. But she never fed again, not yet. Instead, she observed. She watched how the lynx moved, how she circled and paused, how her ears flicked at distant sounds. There was a rhythm to her presence, something careful and constant. Emily began journaling her observations in a leather-bound notebook she had once used for patient notes. The habit soothed her in a way she hadn't expected. It gave her something beyond herself to care for again, something that wasn't broken or bleeding. And still, she did not name the lynx. Not yet. That, too, felt like a line. By the second week of February, the snow along the southern edge of Emily Monroe's cabin had begun to harden into crusted slabs, reflecting the faded blue of the sky in jagged glints. The cold no longer felt sharp. It had settled into her bones, becoming a presence rather than a threat. Winter in the Bitterroot Valley wasn't a season. It was a state of being, a hush that cloaked everything, even memory. Emily had grown used to this rhythm, the slow pulse of the wilderness, the silence that followed her like a patient ghost. Each morning followed the same routine, a thick mug of coffee in her gloved hands, a light wool shawl beneath her heavier coat, and the quiet creak of the rocking chair on her wraparound porch. From there, she could see the clearing, the tree line, and, more recently, her visitor. The lynx returned. Not daily, not predictably, but with enough frequency that Emily no longer questioned whether it was chance. Always in the morning, when the light hadn't yet decided if it was gold or gray, the lynx appeared at the same spot near the rhododendrons. She never approached the porch. Instead, she sat, sometimes for only a minute, sometimes longer. Her pale amber eyes locked on Emily with an unreadable calm. Emily had started calling her Ash, though never out loud. It was a name she gave her only in the pages of the weathered journal she now kept by the window next to her camera. Always ready, though she rarely used it. The notebook had once been used for field reports during deployments. Now it held a growing collection of observations, sketches, temperature records, and quiet thoughts. Ash was sleek, her coat a delicate dappled mix of silver, smoke, and soft cream that darkened near the spine. Her ears were tipped with black tufts, constantly twitching with alertness. She was larger than most domestic cats, but moved with the silence of falling snow. There was a dignity to her, neither feral nor tame, but something entirely self-possessed. It was on one of these mornings, the 12th since Emily had first seen Ash, that she noticed something new. The lynx had appeared just after sunrise. Emily, wrapped in her quilted coat, leaned against the porch post, watching as Ash moved with slow precision through the clearing. But this time, when Ash paused, Emily noticed a second set of prints trailing behind her in the snow. Smaller, lighter, uneven in their spacing. She squinted, heart suddenly taut with curiosity and something more urgent, worry. The small tracks broke off near a patch of fallen pine branches and disappeared into the woods. Ash didn't look back at them. She simply sat, her eyes again meeting Emily's, holding her gaze longer than usual. There was something new in her expression, attention, maybe even fatigue. Her breath came in quick, visible puffs, when she rose and disappeared once more into the underbrush. Emily found herself on her feet, straining for another glimpse. She didn't see the kitten, not that day, not the next, but over the following week. She began noticing those smaller prints more regularly, always alongside Ash's. Never alone, and always ending just beyond the edge of the clearing. Emily resisted the urge to investigate, not wanting to scare the animals or disrupt the path they had chosen. But her journal entries grew longer, more detailed, and tinged with questions. Was it her kitten? Was it healthy? Why did Ash seem uncertain? To distract herself, Emily threw herself deeper into her observations. She began reviewing her old wildlife photography manuals, reading late into the night with a red-lensed flashlight to avoid disturbing her circadian rhythm. One evening, as she was leafing through a book of Appalachian animal behavior studies, a quote struck her. Trust is rare in the wild, but once granted, it must be honored. The words stayed with her long after she'd shut the pages. The next afternoon, Daniel showed up unannounced, his boots crunching across the icy path leading up to her cabin. His olive-green ranger's coat was dusted with salt, and he looked tired, as he always did after his longer patrols. "You've been keeping busy," he said, nodding toward the camera traps she'd recently mounted along the edge of her property. "I wanted to track patterns, movement. That lynx comes back more often than you'd think." Daniel folded his arms, still not feeding her. "No," Emily lied, not convincingly. He gave her a sideways glance. "You know what I think." "I do." Daniel paused, his face softening just slightly. "But I also know you. And if you're seeing a second set of tracks out there, you saw them. I parked lower down the trail. Thought I'd loop around. Saw smaller prints near the ridge trail. If that's a kitten, you need to be careful. She's going to get more defensive, I haven't tried to approach. I swear. Good. Keep it that way." Daniel didn't stay long. They spoke briefly about her cabin's heating system. He offered to help check the chimney, and then he was off, his figure swallowed quickly by the trees. That night, Emily found herself unable to sleep. She sat at the kitchen table, notebook open, sketching the latest print shapes from memory. Her hand moved slowly, translating paw pads and snow impressions into charcoal outlines. In the silence of her home, only the ticking of the old wall clock accompanied her. It wasn't just scientific curiosity anymore. She felt something deeper, an echo of a purpose she thought she'd lost. The feeling of tending to something fragile, of watching over life not her own. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the pine boughs like whispers. Emily looked up from the page and walked to the window. The moon was high and silvered the clearing, and there, barely visible at the edge, was Ash, sitting, watching. Emily whispered into the dark, though she knew the lynx could not hear her. "You're not alone out there. Are you?" The only answer was the cold light in Ash's unmoving eyes. The storm arrived with a violence that blanketed the Bitterroot Mountains in silence. It swept across the valley like a living thing. Blinding snow driven sideways by gale-force winds that screamed through the trees, shaking Emily Monroe's cabin until it groaned like a ship in deep water. The blizzard howled for 3 full days, uninterrupted, relentless, inside her cabin. Emily moved from window to window, but all she could see was white. She kept the stove burning hot, fed it hourly with firewood she'd stacked high against the back wall. Outside, the world had disappeared. No animal sounds, no visible path, only the storm and the unyielding cold. By the 3rd night, her body was tired, but her senses were sharp. Isolation no longer unsettled her. It had become her refuge. Yet there was something that gnawed beneath her calm. The absence of Ash. The lynx hadn't appeared in nearly a week, and with each passing day of the blizzard, Emily's worry deepened. Then, in the early hours of the 4th morning, as the storm began to lose its fury, she heard it. A sound at the door, faint, deliberate, a soft scratch. She paused, holding her breath, unsure if it had been real or imagined. Then it came again, scratch, pause, scratch. It was not the random tap of a branch or the settling of snow. It was rhythmic, purposeful. Emily moved toward the door, heart racing. Her hand hesitated on the latch. She pulled it open slowly. There, just beyond the threshold, half sunk in snow and trembling, stood Ash. The lynx's fur was soaked, ice clinging in brittle tufts to her legs and chest. Her breathing was labored, her body tense, and her eyes, those usually serene, distant amber eyes, were wide with panic, but they weren't what caught Emily's breath. At Ash's feet lay a kitten, tiny, barely larger than a house cat. Its fur was soaked and matted with dried blood. One of its hind legs was bent at an unnatural angle, and its ribs heaved with quick, shallow breaths. It made no sound, only shivered uncontrollably in the snow. Emily's breath caught in her throat, and just like that, memory returned. Not of mountains or trees, but of sand and blood, of torn uniforms and trembling hands, of a canvas tent under mortar fire, a young corporal with shrapnel in his leg, crying for his mother as Emily tied a tourniquet with hands steadier than stone. She hadn't thought about those nights in years, had buried them beneath silence and snowfall. But now, looking down at the tiny broken body in the snow, she knew. The decision was already made. She stepped back, whispered, "Come on, though she knew Ash wouldn't enter. The lynx didn't move, only watched. Emily turned and went inside, already moving with purpose. She didn't think, she didn't hesitate, her mind, trained long ago to act first and feel later, and knew what to do. The past had not left her. It had simply been waiting for this. The morning after the storm was sharp and colorless. The sky, a pale wash above the jagged, snow-choked ridgelines of the Bitterroot Valley. A brittle silence settled over the forest, as if the storm had scrubbed the world clean of motion, sound, even breath. Emily Monroe stood on the porch of her cabin, wrapped in a wool coat, boots crunching softly underfoot as she stepped toward the edge where the snow had drifted nearly to her knees. There, just beyond the steps, sat Ash. The lynx had not moved far since bringing her injured kitten in the middle of the blizzard. She sat now like a statue carved from mist and muscle, her fur still crusted with frost, eyes wide but calm, between her and the cabin. The small shape lay still, barely more than a bundle of damp fur, its hind leg twisted unnaturally, blood drying in clumps along its belly and paw. Emily crouched slowly, careful not to spook either mother or cub. She wore thick leather gloves and carried a soft flannel towel, still warm from the stove. Ash's ears twitched as Emily drew near, but she didn't retreat. Her eyes, amber and unblinking, remained fixed on the human in front of her, with practiced care. Emily wrapped the kitten in the towel. The tiny body shivered but didn't resist. It was lighter than she'd expected, frighteningly so. As she lifted him into her arms, Ash took 2 deliberate steps backward, her tail flicking once, but she didn't flee. Inside. Emily placed the kitten into the old animal carrier she had dusted off the night before. She added a warm water bottle wrapped in another towel for heat and set the carrier by the stove. Close, but not too close. The kitten whimpered softly, curled into the warmth, and fell silent. Emily stood over him, heart thudding. Her hands trembled not from cold, but from the weight of something unspoken. Responsibility, awe, fear. She turned and picked up the landline. The number she dialed was one she'd only written down as a precaution, a just-in-case. Now it felt inevitable. Riversong Wildlife Center, came the voice on the other end, steady, deep, feminine. This is Emily Monroe. I'm south of Darby, off the county road. I have an injured lynx kitten. He was brought to me. A pause. Then, this is Sarah Klein. Tell me everything. Emily spoke quickly but clearly, describing the storm, the scratches at the door, the mother's behavior. She expected skepticism, maybe even disbelief. But Sarah's silence wasn't dismissive, it was analytical. When Emily finished, Sarah replied, "Drive slow. Roads will be hell, but I'll be ready." The call ended. The decision, already made in her bones, now had a destination. Emily packed quickly, spare towels, a flashlight, a small first aid kit. She strapped the carrier into the passenger seat of her Jeep Cherokee, made sure the tires were chained, then spent 30 minutes clearing just enough of a path to reach the forest trail. The air stung her lungs, and the snow groaned beneath every step. She paused at the top of the drive to look back. Ash was gone, but her prints, deep and deliberate, remained pressed into the snow, leading away into the trees, like a mother who had handed off the last piece of her soul and walked into silence. 2 hours later, the Jeep pulled into the drive of Riversong Wildlife Center. Nestled on a broad, flat stretch of forest just north of Stevensville, the building was modest, timber walls, a red metal roof, a solar panel half covered in frost. A large barn sat adjacent, With fenced enclosures barely visible beyond the tree line, a woman stepped out onto the porch as Emily parked. She was tall and lean, her silver-gray hair tied into a low knot beneath a thick wool beanie. She wore an insulated vest over a navy flannel shirt and canvas work pants tucked into snow boots. Her gloves leather and worn at the palms. Sarah Klein. Emily called as she climbed out. "That's me." Sarah's voice matched her presence, firm, economical, but not unfriendly. "You've got the kitten." Emily nodded and opened the passenger door. "He's in here." Sarah lifted the carrier without hesitation. Inside. The interior of the main building smelled of pine shavings and disinfectant. Clean, but not sterile. A young assistant moved quickly to prepare a padded exam table as Sarah unlatched the carrier and carefully removed the kitten. "Male," she murmured, running her fingers gently along his body. 4 to 5 months. Compound fracture here. Looks like he's lost some blood. Frostbite on the ears, too, but he's got a strong pulse. Emily watched, hands clenched at her sides. Will he survive? Sarah didn't look up. Too early to say, but he's a fighter. That much is clear. There was silence for a moment as Sarah began cleaning the wound with practiced precision. Then she spoke again, quieter. "You said his mother brought him to you." "Yes." "She scratched at my door during the storm. She just stood there, waiting." Sarah paused in her work. "That's not instinct. That's not fear or desperation. That's choice." Emily swallowed the lump in her throat. "I think she knew I'd help." Sarah finally looked at her. "That kind of trust is sacred. Don't question it. Just honor it." The snow had melted in patches by the time Emily returned to Riversong Wildlife Center a week after delivering the injured lynx kitten. Spring was still a rumor, whispered by bare branches. But the worst of winter had begun to lift. Ice dripped slowly from the eaves of the red-roofed barn, and muddy ruts had begun to etch the dirt road leading in from the forest. Inside the center's main cabin, warm with the smell of pine shavings and antiseptic, the kitten, now officially named Bran, rested in a large indoor enclosure. The name had come to Emily unexpectedly, drawn from an old Celtic legend she half remembered. A boy sent across the sea with a promise and a burden he did not understand. Bran had survived his own crossing. After all, the blizzard, the broken leg, the breathless hours in the towel. Sarah Klein had accepted the name with a faint nod. "Fitting," she'd said, jotting it down on the medical chart clipped to the side of the enclosure. Bran was roughly 4 months old, his fur still soft and slightly ragged at the edges where frostbite had damaged the tips. The leg fracture had been clean but severe, requiring a small cast and strict confinement. He was malnourished, underweight for his age, and dehydrated when he first arrived. Now, with daily treatment and a specialized feeding plan, his weight was slowly climbing. His ribs no longer jutted out like prison bars. But that wasn't what worried Sarah. "It's the eyes," she said to Emily during one of their evening check-ins. Her voice hushed as they watched Bran from behind a viewing panel. "He doesn't look at us like a wild animal should. There's no fear." Emily stood quietly beside her, arms crossed, jacket still unzipped from the cold outside. "He's just young. He was in pain. He recognizes who helped him." Sarah didn't look away from the enclosure. That's exactly the problem. Bran, at that moment, was crouched low over a stuffed fabric log, batting at it with a healthy dose of enthusiasm. His leg, though still partially bound, no longer slowed him down much, but it wasn't the play that concerned the rehab staff. It was the way he watched humans come and go. Calm, eyes curious rather than cautious. He didn't hide, he didn't hiss, and when one of the interns changed out his water dish, He followed her movements with what could only be described as familiarity. Wild animals weren't supposed to do that. By the end of the second week, Emily had become a regular presence at the center. She made the 2-hour drive from her cabin every third day, bringing fresh towels, homemade baked goods for the staff, and her notebook, which was now filled with entries not only about Ash and Bran, but about animal behavior in general. Her sketches had improved. 2, rough but detailed. The line work more confident. Eyes more alive. Sarah noticed, "You've got the instinct," she said one day as Emily handed her a page depicting Bran mid-stretch, tail lifted in alert curiosity. "I've got the time," Emily replied, "and a need to do something that matters." Sarah studied her for a moment, then said, "If this is something you're serious about, we run certification courses, wildlife rehabilitation, not a weekend hobby, but real work. Permits, medical training, animal handling, ethics, I want in." Sarah nodded once. "Applications in the office, fill it out." The next few weeks passed in a blur of motion and learning. Emily spent her mornings at home buried in course materials, state regulations, dietary charts, post-surgery care routines. She watched recorded lectures at night, scribbled questions in the margins, and practiced constructing basic enrichment tools from wood scraps and rope. She took notes on everything: ambient noise, sleep patterns, feeding responses. Meanwhile, Bran continued to heal. By week 5, the cast came off. He limped at first, favoring the leg but using it more each day. The vet, Dr. Shapiro, a petite, blunt woman in her 40s, with short curly hair and a permanent pen tucked behind her ear, cleared Bran for controlled enclosure exercise. He now had access to a small outdoor run built onto the side of the recovery barn, lined with pine logs, natural brush, and hidden perches. But the behavioral issues deepened. "He lets the interns get too close," Sarah warned one morning as Emily helped clean the viewing area. "He responds to human presence like a domestic animal. Doesn't freeze, doesn't retreat. It's not just familiarity, it's imprinting." Emily swallowed. "So, what does that mean?" "It means if it continues. Releasing him into the wild won't be ethical or safe. Not for him, not for others." The words struck Emily like ice water. She drove home that afternoon with a hollow weight in her chest. Bran was still a wild creature, but already something in him had shifted, permanently or not. No one could say. But if he couldn't be returned to the forest, what then? It was late March when Emily submitted her application to become a certified wildlife care provider under the Montana State Wildlife Partnership. The forms were long, the questions blunt. Why do you want this? What are your long-term intentions? Do you have prior experience with predatory mammals? She answered truthfully. She didn't romanticize Bran. She didn't see herself as a rescuer. She saw herself as a witness, called to responsibility by a silent plea in the snow. Sarah reviewed the forms with her usual reserved thoroughness. "You've done the coursework, you've got land, you've got patience," she said. "That's more than most." "If Bran can't go back to the wild," Emily said, "I want him to have a life that's still close to it, not caged, not a pet, just safe." Sarah nodded, slow. "We'll evaluate when the time comes, but know this, it's a long road. There's regulation, inspections, behavioral assessments. You can't treat him like a companion, not ever, I understand." Sarah smiled faintly. "Good, then we'll see." The April rains came late to the Bitterroot Range, falling in quiet curtains that softened the remnants of snow and soaked deep into the thawing forest floor. The trees, dark and patient, drank in the meltwater, and the world once again turned green. It was the kind of slow, promising spring that made silence feel like a heartbeat. Emily Monroe sat on the porch of her cabin, cradling a mug of tea between her palms. The air smelled like wet cedar and soil, somewhere in the enclosure behind her. Bran stirred. She didn't need to look to know it. She could sense him now, by rhythm, by silence, by something more ancient than speech, since his transfer from Riversong. Bran had remained physically healthy. His fur had thickened to a full coat of gold-speckled ash. His muscles filled out, and his leg, once splinted and frail, moved with almost normal precision. His eyes remained sharp, too sharp, sometimes. What worried Emily wasn't his recovery, it was how fixed he had become on her. He watched her constantly, especially at feeding times, especially when she moved near the enclosure fence to check the gates or refill the enrichment stations. He didn't act aggressively. He didn't retreat. He simply followed her presence. Eyes steady, waiting, watching, expecting. Sarah Klein had noticed it too, still too human-oriented. She'd said during her last visit, arms folded, eyes narrowed under her weather-worn hat. "I don't like how close he gets. He's not acting out." Emily had replied, "That's not the point," Sarah countered. "He's not meant to act out. He's meant to act like he doesn't see you." Emily had no answer for that. But it wasn't just Bran's behavior that changed after the transfer. Ash had returned. The first time. Emily had only caught a glimpse, a flash of fur among the dark trees at the perimeter of the forest, barely visible through the mist. The second time, she saw her more clearly, perched on a low outcrop of granite beyond the enclosure, ears pricked, body still. Ash never approached the cabin, never neared Emily. Her presence was a whisper at the edge of the trees, but she came again and again, always at dusk, always when the forest was between breath and shadow, and each time, Bran came to meet her. They never touched, wire and instinct kept them apart, but they sat facing one another through the mesh wall of the enclosure, silent and unwavering. No calls, no pacing, just presence. Emily watched the scenes unfold from the shadows of her porch. She never interrupted, she never spoke. Something about it felt sacred. She recorded the visits in a small field notebook. The entries were sparse, observational, yet every page held a quiet reverence. Ash appeared again. Bran noticed her within seconds. Neither moved for 12 minutes. The forest fell still. I could hear the meltwater dripping from the roof and the far-off tap of a woodpecker. Nothing else. Ash's visits were irregular but persistent. Once a week, sometimes more, occasionally. She would linger longer, head tilting slightly, as if listening to something she couldn't name. Bran would mirror her. Once. Emily caught Bran pawing softly at the ground near the fence after she had left. As though trying to remember the scent, it unnerved her. Not because it was unnatural, but because it was so clearly longing. That longing began to seep into Emily's dreams. She dreamed of snow again, of that night on the porch, when Ash had appeared with the broken kitten at her feet. She dreamed of the eyes that had stared through the storm, amber, haunted, pleading. She sometimes woke thinking she heard scratches at the door again. Other times, she woke with her hand stretched toward nothing. Emily didn't speak to Sarah about Ash's return. She didn't want to risk the older woman suggesting that the visits be discouraged, or worse, prevented. She justified it by telling herself Ash wasn't approaching humans. She was simply remembering her child. Bran had not changed much in his routine. He remained responsive to enrichment. He showed enthusiasm when new logs or puzzle feeders were introduced, but it wasn't wild energy, it was familiarity, habit. He never attempted to climb the enclosure walls or hide from the movement of people. His reactions, though not tame, lacked the skittish unpredictability of wild lynx behavior. Mike Rourke, who had returned to reinforce the den's insulation, watched Bran with furrowed brows. "He's quiet," Mike said, standing beside the fence with Scout at his feet. Emily glanced over. "He's always quiet." Mike nodded slowly. "Yeah, but it's the kind of quiet that listens too much." On the last evening of April, as the first stars pierced the dusky sky and the wind ran thin through the valley, Ash came once more. Emily had been sitting outside with a sketchpad on her knees when she saw the lynx appear from the trees, like fog forming into shape. Bran had been asleep on the far side of the enclosure but rose as if summoned. He walked, unhurried, toward the wire fence. They sat there together again, Ash and Bran, divided by mesh and memory. Emily didn't sketch them this time. She just watched when Ash turned to leave. Bran didn't move. He sat long after she vanished, eyes fixed on the spot where she had stood, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of what could not be said. The spring wind had changed. It no longer carried the sting of thawing ice or the dry hiss of brittle pine needles. Now it was gentler, warmer, sliding through the canopy with the scent of damp moss and wild violets. The forest around Emily Monroe's cabin seemed to exhale after months of holding its breath, and in the middle of this quiet reawakening, Bran was thriving. The enclosure had become more than just a space. It had become a rhythm, a world each morning, as mist rolled down from the ridge. Bran would emerge from his cedar den, stretch with a luxurious ripple of muscle, and patrol his territory. He was now nearly 7 months old, lean but powerful, his coat thick and sleek with the fullness of health. He moved like the forest itself, soft, deliberate, self-contained, but never indifferent. One of his favorite spots was the artificial stream Emily and Mike Rourke had built along the southern edge of the enclosure. The water was shallow and cold, running over smooth rocks and ferns, mimicking the mountain creeks that crisscrossed the wild beyond the fence. Bran loved it. He would paw at the current, leap from stone to stone, or simply sit with his front feet submerged, watching insects dart across the surface like tiny boats on glass. But the most striking thing remained the way he responded to Ash. She still came, always at dusk, never the same day, sometimes after 3 days, sometimes after 10. But she always came. She never approached the cabin. She never approached Emily. Her presence was solely for Bran, and Bran he always knew. He would pause in whatever he was doing, ears twitching, head turning sharply toward the forest line. Then he would walk to the section of fencing that faced the pines, his pace unhurried, his steps certain. Ash would already be there, sitting, waiting. They would stare, no sounds, no movement, just that wordless connection that Emily had come to see as more sacred than any mother-child bond she had witnessed in the human world. This wasn't about protection anymore, or survival, or even memory. It was something older. One afternoon, as Emily reviewed camera footage from the perimeter motion sensors, she heard a knock on the cabin's door. She wiped her hands and opened it to find Daniel Gray standing there, wind-blown and cautious. Daniel, once a forest ranger assigned to the Bitterroot sector, had aged into a quiet and skeptical presence. His frame was tall and wiry, his face lined from years of high-altitude sun, and his voice was clipped with the directness of someone used to giving warnings, not conversations. He and Emily hadn't spoken much since their first disagreement months earlier, when she'd started feeding Ash, when he'd warned her about interfering with wildlife. But now, he looked different, less guarded. "Got your note," he said, nodding toward the camera footage spread out across her porch table. "Heard about the setup from Mike." Emily offered him a quiet smile. "Thought you might be curious." Daniel walked inside without waiting for an invitation, though he paused long enough to wipe snow mud from his boots. He leaned over the table, scanning the grainy nighttime images that showed a lynx sitting at the edge of the fence, illuminated faintly by moonlight. "That her?" he asked. Emily nodded. "Ash. She comes about once a week. Bran waits for her." Daniel didn't speak for a moment. Then, "I've never seen anything like this." His voice wasn't skeptical, it was reverent. He straightened up. "You need more than these basic trail cams. I've got a set of thermal sensors. I can help you rig something better. Real-time field scans." Emily blinked. "You'd help with that." He met her gaze, and something in his expression, some weather-worn humility, softened. "I was wrong." He said, "I thought you were trying to make a pet out of a predator. But you're not keeping him. You're holding space for him and for her." Emily looked down at the table. They did all the choosing. "I just opened the door that evening." They installed 2 new cameras along the forest-facing side of Bran's enclosure. One was motion-triggered, the other equipped with night vision and thermal overlay. Daniel adjusted the angles, showing Emily how to monitor heat signatures through the console he'd set up in her study. "Won't disturb her," he said, "but it'll give you better data. You can document the interactions." "Interactions," Emily echoed. "That's one way to put it." Daniel's mouth quirked in a rare half-smile. "Call it what you want. Still looks like devotion to me." Later that night, under a waxing moon, Bran stirred from his resting place atop the boulder in the center of his enclosure. He sniffed the wind and moved silently to the fence. Ash was already there. Emily stood in the shadows of her porch, arms folded around her chest. Daniel was beside her now, silent. Ash and Bran didn't touch, but they didn't need to. They simply looked. Minutes passed, then Ash rose, turned, and vanished into the trees. Bran remained a while longer, then returned to his den, pausing once to glance toward the cabin, toward them. Not for food, not for attention, but for something else. Something neither Emily nor Daniel could name. The mountains were green again. Not the hesitant green of early spring, but the full, saturated green of summer's first breath. The canopy above the bitterroot glowed in the afternoon light, filtering warmth through thousands of leaves, each trembling with a kind of secret life. A soft breeze carried the scent of pine, wet bark, and the faint sweetness of wild honeysuckle. At the edge of the forest, near the modest cabin Emily Monroe had long since come to call not just home, but sanctuary. The world had slowed to a rhythm as old as the trees. Inside her study, bathed in golden light from the western window, Emily sat hunched over her desk, sorting through the last proofs for her new book, Echo of the Pines. The title had come to her one morning after watching the forest flicker alive at dawn. The same morning she'd spotted Ash for the last time. If it could even be called spotting, the silver-gray lynx had glided through the trees like mist over stone, her form barely more than a shadow between shafts of sunlight. She hadn't approached the enclosure, hadn't even paused, but she had been there, and Emily had known. That had been nearly 2 months ago. Bran, now nearly a year and a half old, had grown into his strength. He was no longer the uncertain, limping creature bundled in a towel. His coat was radiant, thick with the deep hues of adult lynx, grays and golds, and faint black rosettes, and the regal tufts of his ears sharper than ever. He remained active in his enclosure, especially around dusk. The artificial stream had become his favorite haunt. He would pounce on shadows, stalk frogs that ventured too close, or simply lay across a sun-warmed boulder and watch the canopy flicker with birds. But what Emily cherished most were the quiet moments. The way Bran still approached the eastern fence at twilight. The way he still looked toward the trees, waiting, wondering, or simply remembering that summer. Emily had been invited to present her work at the Rocky Mountain Conservation Summit. Her photographs, captured both from mounted cameras and her long lens, had begun to draw attention among wildlife circles. But it wasn't just the technical quality or rare subject matter, it was the story. Ash and Bran, mother and child, separated by necessity, not by lack of love. She hadn't framed them as domestic or dramatic. She let the images speak. A shadowed silhouette of Bran pawing at the mesh. Ash sitting 3 feet beyond it, unmoving. A thermal overlay showing 2 hearts, aligned through wire. No bars, just stillness. Emily's publisher, an excitable woman named Monica Ray, had cried when she saw the first mock-up. Monica, in her early 50s, had short silver hair always swept back in a clip and wore high boots even in summer. She had once worked for National Geographic and still carried the crisp. Observant energy of field photographers. "I've seen 1,000 stories," she said, flipping slowly through the pages. But this is a hymn. Not every moment of the year had been easy. There had been the week Bran stopped eating after a thunderstorm cracked a tree near his enclosure. The sound had frightened him, triggered something deep. Emily had slept on the porch for 2 nights, just out of his sight, reading aloud softly in the dark. It wasn't what a scientist would recommend. It wasn't protocol, but it had worked. There had also been a break-in reported in the nearby valley, poachers. Someone said, rumors only. But Emily had called Daniel, and within 24 hours, extra security sensors were installed. He came out more often now, though he never stayed long. He remained quiet, guarded. But there was peace in his presence. He respected the silence of the place now. Ash's visits had grown fewer and further between. Emily never expected her to stay. Even the strongest bonds in nature eventually released. That was the beauty of it. On some evenings, just after the light had fallen and before the wind died down, Emily would sit by the porch with a mug of tea and scroll through the live camera feeds. Sometimes she saw only wind-stirred leaves, a raccoon, a deer. Once, a black bear cub sniffing at the fence before waddling off. But once, in early June, she saw her, Ash. Only for a moment. She had passed across the outer camera's field, a flash of silver gray between the pines, not slowing, not stopping, just there and gone. A final echo. On the morning her book went to print. Emily walked into Bran's enclosure. He was lounging on his perch, head on his paws, but he lifted it as she approached, blinking sleepily. She knelt a few feet away, placed the first printed proof beside her on the grass. "You made this possible," she said, "both of you." Bran didn't move, but his gaze stayed on her. "You were never meant to be mine." She added, "But you trusted me, and that matters." The wind stirred the grass. A jay cried out from somewhere high. Bran blinked. She smiled, stood, and left the book resting against the rock that evening on one of the motion cams. She saw him sniff at it, then sit down beside it, facing the trees sometimes. Miracles don't arrive with thunder or fire. Sometimes. They come on silent pause under moonlight, with no words, just trust. This story began with a quiet offering, a bowl of food placed at the edge of a clearing, but it became something far greater. It became a bond between species, a connection that defied instinct, distance, and time. Bran and Ash were never meant to stay together forever. Nature doesn't promise permanence, but in their fleeting reunions, in every glance through the wire, we were reminded of something sacred, that love does not need language, that trust, once given, is a gift beyond measure. Emily didn't set out to become a savior. She simply said yes when a wild creature asked for help. That yes became a covenant, a promise kept through storms, silence, and seasons, and in her quiet obedience, we can see the hand of God moving in subtle ways, because sometimes the most divine miracles are not the ones that save the world, but the ones that change one life. So if you believe in the power of compassion, in the quiet miracles of the forest, and in the unseen work of God in all creation, leave a comment below and type Amen. Share this story with someone who needs to believe again. Subscribe for more real stories that remind us. Love lives in the unlikeliest places. May God bless you and guide you to the kind of peace that Emily found, one quiet choice at a time.